Hey guys, I'm Papa Pete, and welcome to today's episode of the 125. The 125 is a YouTube show focusing on the 125 original games released for the Intellivision System between 1979 and 1989. Now, it's a little bit different type of show because each episode actually consists of more than one video. You have this video, which is the history of the game and a review of the game, as well as an additional video that just strictly deals with some gameplay. Anyway, guys, today's episode is the first visit we've taken to an Atarisoft cartridge. And today's episode, Centipede. Stick around. Before starting today's episode, I'd like to give a special thank you to the 125's official sponsor, IntellivisionCollector.com. Intellivision Collector is your one-stop for anything that you need for your Intellivision collection. With over 730 items currently listed on the site, you'll find not only lots of games, but systems and hardware, as well as repair parts, things like power and main boards, system shells, RF adapters, and even controller rebuild kits. Intellivision Collector is also currently in negotiation with several of the major players in the Intellivision homebrew community, so hopefully, one day soon, it'll be the primary location where you can find all the classic as well as the newest releases from all Intellivision homebrew creators. The site has had many recent additions and is updated regularly, so be sure to check out IntellivisionCollector.com. In 1983, Atari decided they were going to break into the Mattel and television market. They decided to incorporate into their own division, Atarisoft, a group led by Russ Haft, formerly of Mattel and Television. They hired him away from Mattel and Television to introduce some of their own arcade properties onto the system. After all, Coleco had already ported many of their arcade titles to the Intellivision, and Mattel themselves had already put out the system changer for the Intellivision 2, as well as introduced the M-Network line of basically ported Intellivision cartridges to play on the Atari 2600. The console wars of those times were in full force, with the crash just looming in the near future. Now, based upon the fact that Atari had lured away Russ Haft from Mattel, Mattel countered with a $40 million lawsuit. Nonetheless, Atarisoft didn't back down, and they announced in June 1983 that they'd be releasing 3 of their arcade ports for the Intellivision system. Later that fall, just in time for Christmas, Defender, Pac-Man, and today's game, Centipede, were released for the Intellivision system. Now, as for the lawsuit, we all know what happened with the crash very shortly thereafter. In January 1984, Mattel Electronics ceased to exist. Atarisoft also stopped producing games. They didn't put out any of the other titles that they had planned, so these 3 games were the only games that were ever released for the Intellivision from Atarisoft. Mark Kennedy was the lead programmer for Centipede, with Eric Wells doing a lot of the graphics. Russ Haft, the aforementioned Russ Haft, also worked on the sound, and their job altogether was to make the absolute best port of Centipede that they could possibly make for the Intellivision system. So, let's look at how they did. Centipede, as you probably know, originated as an Atari arcade release back in June 1981. Its frantic shooter-style action proved to be one of the most popular games in the arcade's golden age. Like its predecessor, Missile Command, the primary controller on Centipede was also a trackball. There are lots of subtle differences in the backstory of the game between the different ports, but generally speaking, the player is defending their mushroom garden with their magic wand from an incoming invasion of various evil insects. Now, Atari ported Centipede to all kinds of games. The Atari 2600, the 5200, the 7800, their computer line, the 8-bit computer line, and then under the Atarisoft name, they put it out for the Commodore 64, the ColecoVision, the Apple II, and, of course, the Intellivision. Like most arcade games back in that time, the object of the game is to score as many points as possible. The game field in Centipede is basically a black screen dotted with mushrooms that represents your mushroom garden. And there's a centipede that enters from the top of the screen and goes back and forth horizontally until it either hits the side of the screen or runs into a mushroom. at which point it changes directions and drops down a line till it gets down to the character. And the character itself, with your magic wand, you can move around about the bottom, I'll say 5th or 6th of the screen. So you have a little bit of vertical movement, plus all the horizontal movement of the screen, and shooting bolts, lightning bolts, or sparks, or whatever you want to call them, up at the centipede and also at the mushrooms and other insects that attack. The vertical movement wasn't something that you often saw in games of that age. The ability to vertically move a little bit, even the ability to dodge and scamper around as you shot at the enemies. Speaking of enemies, there were 3 other insects to battle that all had different roles in the game. First of all, there was the spider, which dances around in the same area of the game field where the player controls their wand. And yes, you could hit it, and depending on how far away from you, there were different amounts of points for it, but no matter what, even when you hit it and destroyed it, it still came back shortly thereafter. Now, the spider also destroyed any mushrooms that it ran into, and to tell you the truth, I'm not really sure if that was detrimental or helpful to the character. The next insect to bring up is the flea. The flea starts at the top of the screen and it drops down to the bottom, planting mushrooms as it goes. It starts to appear when you clear out too many of the mushrooms from around where the wand is, and it's really quite dangerous because it takes 2 hits to kill. And adding to that fact is that when you hit it the first time, it starts to drop at double the speed, so it's easy to hit it once, but it flashes down on you really quickly and it's hard to hit it that second time. The 4th and final insect in Centipede is the scorpion. The scorpion crosses the playfield horizontally, crosses over top of mushrooms, poisoning them as it goes. The poisoned mushrooms change the same colors as scorpion, and I'll bring up more about these poisoned mushrooms as it goes. But let me say this, as the game goes on, the scorpion becomes more and more frequent and moves more and more quickly, and it's very difficult to hit, even in the early stages. Now let's get back to talking about the centipede itself. As I said before, the centipede consists of 10 segments, and they come onto the screen at the top, they move horizontally, and they drop a line in reverse every time they either hit the edge of the screen or they hit a mushroom. If you shoot the centipede with your wand, the segment that you hit turns into a mushroom, and the centipede itself splits into 2 individual centipedes, both traveling independently, increasing totally the excitement and the action in the game. There are actually 2 different types of segments in each centipede. There are body segments and there are head segments. And when you hit a segment, it turns into a mushroom, and the 2 parts broke together, well, one of them is going to turn into a new head segment. So it's kind of neat. They both go down with their own head segments, and as the levels progress, actually the combination of head segments to body segments gets changes and gets more difficult each time. One other thing that you really need to know about the centipedes is, remember I talked about the poison mushrooms earlier on, about the scorpion crosses and it poisons different mushrooms? If a centipede head runs into one of these poison mushrooms, the centipede goes crazy and it immediately plummets down to the bottom of the screen. So you want to talk about some exciting action? That's when it really happens. As I said before, as with most of the arcade games back from this era, the object of the game is to score as many points as possible. You're going for the high score. So, the player starts each game with 3 wands and gains another one every 10,000 points. Each body segment in the centipede is worth 10 points. The head segments, though, are worth a lot more. They're worth 100 points each. Fleas are worth 200 points. But like I said before, they're very hard to hit. You hit them that first time and their speed doubles. So you got to be really well lined up to get rid of a flea. Scorpions are worth a whopping 1,000 points, but they're very hard to hit up through all the mushrooms in the garden. But speaking of the mushrooms are also worth points. Every time you hit a mushroom, it's worth 1 point. It takes 3 hits to destroy a mushroom. That's when you get your point. But any mushrooms that you hit, that's regular mushrooms that are partial. In other words, you've hit it only once or twice, but there's still a little bit of it there, that are still there at the end of a round, are worth a bonus of 5 points. Why they have to be partial, I don't know. Because it's different with poison mushrooms. You get 5 points for hitting poison mushrooms, but anyone that's left at the end of a round, whether they're partial or whole, you get that 5-point bonus. Now this leaves the spider, and the spider is dancing around in the area where your wand is. I consider it one of the most dangerous things in the game, but it's also possibly, in my opinion, the best source for points. I said to you, the closer it is to you, it will give you more points. Well, if you hit the spider while you're quite a ways away, it's worth 300 points. If it's at moderate range, it's worth 600 points. But if you can hit that spider when it's right next to you, you get a whopping 900 points. It's a risky strategy to try to hit those close to you because, like I said, they're dangerous. You're going to lose lives that way. But you still can really score a lot of points with those spiders if you hit them when they're right on top of you. First of all, obviously the original arcade Centipede used the trackball, and this wasn't possible at all for the Intellivision. That was the case with most of the ports for the home consoles. Yes, there were a couple of systems like the ColecoVision and the Atari 5200 that released peripherals that were trackballs for their systems, but the vast majority had to adapt Centipede to a different gameplay, same as Missile Command. I gotta say that, yes, of course, you have to use the disc to move the wand around the game field, but frankly, I find it very responsive, it moves very quick, and it's very smooth. I have no difficulty whatsoever in using the gamepad to control the wand, moving it around the field, trying to evade the spiders or dodge the fleas or whatever. It really works well. The next aspect that I want to talk about is the firing. And with Centipede, you can only fire one bullet at a time. You can only have one bullet, one spark, whatever you want to call it, on the screen. So you fire by hitting the top side button. Well, obviously, you're trying to fire frantically enough. It's not very productive just to manually hit that button. So there's two other options. The next option is you hold in that button, like a lot of games. If you hold in the button, it will repeatedly fire when it can. But even that itself can become tiresome, so they put a nice auto-fire feature in the game, whereas once you're playing, if you hit any button on the keypad, you enter an auto-fire mode, and all you have to worry about is controlling your wand with the disc. You don't have to do anything to fire, it'll just automatically fire as rapidly as possible. Does that cause some times when you might miss something that you could shoot otherwise? Yeah, possibly, but at the end of the day, it's going to allow you to play a lot longer without fatiguing your hands. Another interesting control feature of Centipede, which you might not have been aware of, is that you can actually have little like sprint feature in your wand. You can increase the speed that you can move your wand by holding in the lower side button. I find the wand moves very quickly as it is, so it's really pretty risky to use this feature because it's going to be kind of uncontrollable. But at the same time, if you're really in a pinch, you could use that lower side button to zip your wand out of a predicament and maybe save it. But I don't use it very much, but it's there if you do want to. The only other aspect of, I'll call it control, but the thing that I want to talk about here is the fact that you can play this either as a one-player game or as a two-player alternating game. And the way you pick your two-player game if you want to play it is when you go to start your game from either the title screen or the demo screen, you just hit number 2. So to start a one-player game, no, you don't hit number 1, you could hit any other button. I thought it was a pretty good little effect, actually, a good idea, because you're going to want to intentionally start at 2, but for a one-player game, you just hit any button. There are no speed variations. The graphics in Centipede are very acceptable, if not good. Each different insect, as well as your wand, and the mushrooms themselves have very distinct shapes. You can tell exactly what they are. And yes, they are only one color sprites, as opposed to the multicolor of many other ports and the original arcade version. But overall, you can really tell what things are, and they look very good. You combine all these different features along with the flashing Atari logo that you have on the title screen, which kind of ticked off the Mattel people because they didn't like to see their competitor's logo so prominently displayed on one of their games. And it really is very, very acceptable, if not good, graphics. Now, I'll tell you this, little variety in sounds from events that are going on the playfield go a long way to make it a better gameplay environment, let's say. And each of the different bugs sort of have their own sound palette that come out when they appear on screen. Because they're on screen, off screen, you hit them, the sounds go away, the sounds come on, you hear the scurrying of the scorpion, the The falling of the flea is a big thing, because usually you won't see one flea. There'll be like one, and then two, and then three, and you're trying to dodge them. And the sounds themselves are very, very, they're uplifting. They really get you excited as you play the game. So I'm going to say the sounds in Centipede are really excellent. Unfortunately, we didn't have Centipede back when I was a kid. It's just one of those games we didn't have. But remember, I was a kid of the 80s, so I spent lots of time in the arcades, and I was very familiar with Centipede in the arcade. Played it a ton. Played it on different ports as well. Like I played it on the Atari, etc., etc. So it's not something that I'm incredibly new to. When Atarisoft ceased to be back in 1984, all of their properties were bought up by Intellivision Collector. And so there was some hope that we're going to get some of the other releases which have been in the planning stages for Atarisoft. Games like Galaxian, Jungle Hunt, Joust, but unfortunately it just never came to be. That being said, there was one game that Intellivision Collector did get to release that started off as in the planning stages from Atarisoft, and that was Dig Dug. So it wasn't all bad news. One thing I have to say about this, though, is it is certainly not a Coleco release. There's no suspicion that Atarisoft possibly sabotaged their own properties in order to make their own systems look good. I feel that Atarisoft did as good a job as possible making Centipede for the Intellivision System, and they gave it smooth gameplay. It really presented the original arcade experience in a very positive manner. The graphics are well done, and the sounds, frankly, are excellent. It's the kind of game that you could pop into the Intellivision System every now and again, and you can have a lot of fun. For all of these reasons, I'm going to sit back and I'm going to give Centipede by Atarisoft a 7 out of 10 rating. Well, guys, that's it for today's episode of the 125. I've really enjoyed looking at Atarisoft Centipede for the Intellivision System. I hadn't spent that much time with it before. Don't forget to check out the gameplay video. There's, as with every one of my episodes of the 125, there also are gameplay videos to accompany these review videos. Thanks for spending a little bit of time with me today, guys. Don't forget to hit like, comment, subscribe, and I can't wait to see you on the next episode of the 125. Take care.
Papa Pete, the old ass gamer. Papa Pete, the old ass gamer. If you haven't grown up